Thank you so much for inviting me. Of course, I'm thrilled whenever Fortune magazine wonders anything positive out loud about Sakti3. I want to start off by pointing out that today, in March of 2015, so this will date the recording of this event, we are at about 90% of our storage capacity for oil on planet Earth. We're pumping it out so fast, we've run out of places to put it. The notion that we were going to run out of oil and run out of fossil fuels in general was completely wrong, because of course what happened is when people decided that they needed more of this fuel, they got better at cracking it. They got better at taking it out of the ground, better at refining it, better at finding new sources for it. So the notional thinking about peak oil and the availability of this product, of this commoditized product, was actually not right. Why? Because it failed to take into account ingenuity. Failed to take that into account. Now, I hear people talk about two things, and I tend to think about two other things that could replace those. One is belief, and I prefer science and fact, and another is trend, and I prefer need, because innovative human beings actually do invent the future, and they invent based on the needs that they identify. In less than 20 years, China has pulled 600 people out of poverty and into the middle class. It's extraordinary. So yes, there are problems on planet Earth, to be sure. 2.6 billion people on planet Earth do not have access to clean water and sanitation. 4,000 children a day die from those effects, from those needs. But mythic things have happened with invention. So the need is very clear. Now, if the emerging economies, if these 23 plus megacities decide to execute the same infrastructures that we have, now we're all in a lot of trouble. And intelligent people, but most importantly, educated people, know that that's the case. And that kind of education is not inaccessible to people who have just joined the middle class. In fact, people around the world are making intelligent choices about what they want their infrastructures to be. So the infrastructure of the future is not going to be random. It's not going to be based on a collection of trends. It's going to be based on needs. And education is a key piece to that. The disruption that will occur might be labeled a trend. It might actually correctly be identified as a number of different disruptions. I happen to work in batteries. I happen to work in energy storage, and I'll talk more about that at the end. But I believe that that's a critical human need. The ability to store energy, move aphysical distances, and communicate aphysical distances is a basic human desire, a human need. The reality is that there are a lot of people working in other technology areas. All of a sudden something pops up like a Dirac Delta, and it looks like something has just been invented by maybe one company or a small collection of companies. But the reality is the pressure is global for new infrastructures. The pressure is entirely global. So the thinking that the emerging economies will use our same infrastructure, in fact, that we will even continue to use our same infrastructure, is not right. The question is, what's going to be required in order to shift that infrastructure? So I tend to think, because of what I do in terms of time scales and length scales, it's been pointed out from a great distance that our pale blue dot is borderless. We might think of that as a particle. In my scientific life, I've studied a lot of particles. And what is a particle, or what is the right time scale or the length scale to do an engineering or a science or a technology problem? It would be facile to say it's only the math, because it actually is a craft and it is an art. And I've been fortunate to work with many, many bright people, all with different points of view, in kinetics, in heat transfer, in diffusion, in mechanics, to study how to put things together to make them work properly. And batteries are one example of that. But diffusion, heat transfer, mechanics, solid mechanics, statistics, choosing the right time scale and choosing the right length scale to solve a problem like that, it's probably fairly obvious that that's important. Choosing the right time scale and choosing the right length scale to solve a societal problem is also very important. So we tend to have very reflexive responses to government. There are people who are for government, against government, small government, big government. But the fundamental truth is that the government is actually an expression of public will. And it's also an expression of the public will's timescale and length scale for solving a problem. So if we think about the length scale as really being able to drive as far as possible before you stop at the next gas station, versus thinking about the length scale as the time in which you haven't created an environmental ill in your travel, you come at two very different solutions. If you think at the time scale as in being profitable in 6 weeks or a quarter, versus the time scale of actually having a sustainable economy, you come to very different answers. And so the notion of sustainability, even though it's become almost a cliche in what I a little bit wryly refer to as thought leader circles, is actually a very real mathematical concept. And it requires that you pick a time to solve for. So if you actually pick a 10-year or 20-year or 100-year, as RICARDO has just had the good fortune and the hard work to celebrate, you come at a solution where you have to think about the entire life cycle. You can't just restrict your analysis to raw materials in, products out, and calculate the profitability. It's not reasonable. You actually have to think about the complete life cycle of that product. What happens after it's used, and what is the impact on the environment and the production of new goods? And more importantly, what is the impact on people's lives? The timescale of batteries is something that we've thought very deeply about. We collaborate with Professor Christian Sastry at the University of Michigan, who is also my husband. Our favorite collaborations are our children, Katie and Peter. We have other collaborations as well. We hope that they'll have beneficial impact on people's ability to make good science-based and science-driven decisions about what to build. So the life cycle analysis of battery electric vehicles versus IC engine-driven vehicles is actually very favorable. And when you think about what it takes to pull fossil fuels out of the ground and drive an IC engine, build that engine, it's heavy, it's made out of metal, it requires a lot of refinement of raw materials to create that product, versus making a battery, it turns out, because of the reuse profile, or the recyclability profile of a battery, you're actually much better off. You actually have a much reduced consequence. But that battery today contains liquids, which actually over time erode the cathode. So I apologize for talking a little bit about the technology, but I do think it's important to point out that there are root causes for why people study what they study. Batteries today are limited in lifetime because they use liquid electrolytes. If you could make them all solid, you could eliminate a lot of ills. And it turns out the life cycle analysis on an all-solid battery is even better than the life cycle analysis on a liquid electrolyte system. So my team at Sakti3 and I decided to work on solid-state batteries. My hope is that our education shifts so that we can not only utilize all the wattage, all the intelligence, all the goodwill of generations of students who cycle through our improbable universities, and actually ask them to think up front about what they decide to work on, because that's just as important as the work that they do. So interestingly, we think a lot about what the infrastructure of the future is going to be, and it's very clear that younger generations are selecting different technologies than more senior generations. The long view is that education will govern that. So I was privileged to be a professor for 17 years, and I had many of generations of students go out, and many of them have carved out careers and positions of leadership which bring me great pride at having helped them do. And one of the things you learn when you get to an advanced age is that, yes, the nuts and bolts that you taught, the nuts and bolts that you mentored people on, and the problems that you helped them solve were important. The mindset was more important. The mindset of stopping and thinking about the problem that you select was actually more important. And my former students and many of my colleagues and I talk about that at great length. So being thoughtful about what we work on is not just a philosophical decision, it's also a scientific decision. The long view, the time scale of the problems we decide to work on really matter. So, brass tacks, That means doing a life cycle analysis of the products. That doesn't mean deferring it to 20 years and asking someone else to remediate what you've built. That doesn't mean accepting an infrastructure and deciding only to execute a technology within that infrastructure. Yes, it means questioning the orthodoxy, but it also means doing so thoughtfully and with mathematics and science. The role of government in this cannot be overstated. It's interesting to me that people, some will reflexively refer to regulation in a derisive way. The reality is, it is fundamentally an expression of public will. And in an era where less than half of the electorate actually turns up, this is quite dangerous. Making a decision about what we want the infrastructures to be for our grandchildren matters. And government regulation drives the toolkit that engineers and scientists have to work from. So if policy forbids certain technologies from ever seeing light of day, intelligent, hardworking engineers and technologies will choose to work on what exists. They'll choose to work where the jobs exist. So it's incredibly important, and I hope that, and perhaps my comments are probably inartful, but there are many very accomplished speakers at this symposium. I hope that people will think about what policy means in terms of guiding not only the today solution, but also what environment it gives to the people coming up who will create new technologies that fit into that infrastructure. Universities in this country are incredibly improbable. The notion of taking a huge amount of personal and family wealth and dedicate it to put your own child 4 years in an environment surrounded by people who are completely driven and obsessed with their area of expertise, that sacrifice, that decision is completely improbable, and it has changed the world. The world has never seen a university system like that we enjoy in the United States. And it has the benefit of exporting technology around the planet. So that can't stop, and education can't stop. What we see now is that technology, the rapidity of change is actually increasing, and the role of universities in training has become more important, and it's tied inextricably with public service. These 2.6 billion people who do not have access at present to clean water and sanitation, their problems are being addressed. Not fast enough for anybody's taste, of course, but they're being addressed not only by governments, but by volunteers. I'll put a plug in for Engineers Without Borders, which is an organization that my team volunteers for. We change our heads when we commit to public service. We change our heads when we think thoughtfully about what problem to work on. And so the infrastructure of the future is not something that's just going to happen to us. It's going to be something that we decide to create. So public service and universities will play a huge role in that. Back to energy storage. We've seen in the last 100 years, during which RICARDO has grown, a vibrant and changing and really impressive portfolio of products and services. We see RICARDO as a company that's actually displayed some of the changes in our favorite technology in batteries. So moving from a starter system to a traction battery has been a huge change over 100 years. And the next changes, as my colleague Karina Morley is working on in self-driving cars and so forth, will also tie into those technology changes. A core technology that enables all of that is energy storage. It's not going away. And although in this country we think of storing energy right now in a liquid fuel that's replenished at a gas station but simply burned, in the emerging economies, and really in our own reality in the future, it will be through a renewable resource. It's interesting to me that we in this country are sometimes a little astonished by the sources of energy that can go into a battery electric vehicle, whereas elsewhere on the planet that hasn't lived through execution of a complete fueled infrastructure, it's completely normal. It's completely obvious. Why on earth would I put in a huge pipeline and run liquid fuels that I have to buy from possibly hostile foreign governments and protect with military might? Why would I do that? Why wouldn't I just put up a wind turbine or a solar array? And why wouldn't I figure out how to take all of my engineering and science talent and move it onto that problem? Because it actually would make economic sense. So the point of energy storage is that it actually is the fulcrum. It actually balances all of the early stage and all the late stage technologies, which is why I've actually enjoyed working on the problem all these years. To us, we see moving to solid state batteries, better power electronics, self-driving cars, all of these changes in the infrastructures is working together. And we remain very committed and very excited about working on these problems that go into what we feel is a thoughtful and best infrastructure for the planet. For us at Sakti3, we believe that the missions of new technology, profitability, education, public service are all important and actually support one another. So I'll end my remarks there, and I look forward to the panel, but I thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today.